Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to our webinar series. Thanks so much for coming along today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I live and work on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country and pay my respects to elders past and present. Sovereignty was never ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Make sure you head on over to the Uluru Statement from the Heart and inform yourself about the upcoming referendum, the question that you'll be asked to answer, and make a note of any other questions that friends or family might have and see if you can reach out to them in the meantime. There's not that long until the vote on October the 14th. Days and times for our webinars do vary, so please head on over to australiainstitute.org.au to find out all the latest information, including our upcoming webinar with Australian Foreign Affairs. We will be discussing Australia's partnership and interests with China and our relationship with China. And just a few tips before we begin to help things run smoothly. If you hover over the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should be able to see a Q&A box where you can type in questions for our panel today. You can also upvote and make comments on other people's questions. And a reminder to keep things civil and on topic in the chat, or we'll remove you. And lastly, a reminder that this discussion is being recorded. It will go up on our website and on YouTube later today for anyone who needs to track this down later. So if you are like me, who can I hear speaking there in the background? If you are like me, you love Australia's spectacular native forests and spend as much time in them as you can. Ancient trees tower over us when we're out on bushwalks, cooling us down, cleaning the air, and providing important habitat for Australia's beautiful wildlife. Many of Australia's plant and animal species cannot be found anywhere else on Earth. So it's no wonder that our forests have captured Australians' hearts and imaginations. But Australia also has a long history of land clearing and native forest logging. Since colonisation, around 40% of our native forests have been lost, and native forest logging continues to threaten their survival. Every year, around 2% of Australia's native forests are logged, which is pretty alarming, especially given how important they are to tackling climate change. But it is not our only option. You might have heard in the news lately that many Australian states are phasing out native forest logging. Victoria will end native forest logging in December this year, and Western Australia will end native forest logging in early 2024. These are steps in the right direction, but don't protect all of Australia's forests. So I'm delighted to introduce our speakers today, environmentalist, founder of the Bob Brown Foundation and former leader of the Australian Greens, Bob Brown. G'day, Bob.
G'day, Eb.
And Professor Brendan Mackey, Director of the Griffith Climate Action Beacon and Coordinating Lead Author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 2022 report on impacts, vulnerability and adaptation. G'day, Professor Brendan Mackey. Thanks for joining us.
Morning.
And today they'll be in conversation with my colleague, Polly Hemming, Director of our Climate and Energy Program. Before Polly kicks off with our conversation about ending native forest logging today, Bob, I just wanted to come to you first. Obviously, you've devoted a huge portion of your life and career to protecting Australia's native forests. What is it about our native forests that you so love, and why has this been such an important issue for the environment movement and for you personally over the last few decades?
Well, thank you, Ebony. Well, and Polly, two things there. Firstly, we are in perhaps the most secure, or one of the most secure democracies on the face of the planet, and one of the richest countries in the world. So we're, by and large, have got the best opportunity to take action in protecting nature of anybody on the planet. We're certainly not part of that suite of countries, largely in South America and the Philippines, for example, where nearly 200 environmentalists were murdered last year. That doesn't happen to us. So we've got the opportunity to take some action here without having our civil liberties infringed in the way they are overseas. The second thing is we also have a wonderful range of forests, from the Daintree tropical rainforest to the north to Tarkina, the great temperate rainforest in Tasmania, and then the suite of eucalypts right across the country. And they're full of an array of wildlife, as you said in the introduction, which is not found anywhere else on Earth. And yet they're being destroyed. And that 2% leads to 100% destruction within 50 years. But the truth is we've lost most of it. It's been either removed or degraded. And when you get to the giant trees, Eucalyptus regnans, the tallest trees ever on Earth, and the biggest ones of those were smashed down in eastern Victoria last century, but we've got a repository of them in Tasmania. There's just a few percent left of those, and the logging of those is an absolute tragedy, and the wildlife that goes with it. And we all come from the forest. We all come from nature. That's why we give each other flowers as an act of devotion. Give somebody a bunch of plastic flowers, no matter how good and well scented they are, and you'll lose them. But you give them a bunch of flowers and they feel really chuffed. And that's because our soul, our spirit, our heart, as well as our physical bodies, is adapted from the forest. And so we relate to the forest in heart and in soul. They give us adventure, they give us inspiration, and they give us medicines, and they give us well-being, mental well-being. And so it's up to us to make sure that they're there for future generations and for our fellow species. I love being part of the campaigning, the huge campaigning, and it's growing rapidly in Australia, for saving what's left of our native forests and wildlife.
Thanks, Bob. Polly, I'll hand over to you. As we said, this is an issue that's kind of emerged because of the moves of state governments. So I'll hand over to you for the next part of the conversation.
Sure. Sorry, for some reason I'm tearing up. Must be the pollen count in the studio today. Thank you, Eb. Thank you, Bob, and thank you, Brendan, for joining us. It feel like I'm sort of wedged between giants here, which is also a good opportunity to promote Bob's film if you haven't seen it, The Giants. But no, you two are so respected in this field and in Australia. This is a big issue. Our forests provide big benefits, and the logging that damage does is big. It's significant. But what I wanted to do first up is just provide a bit of context, because this is not a big industry. It's not a big employer, and it's not very profitable. So we have this enormous debate around this tiny languishing industry that is being propped up by taxpayers and that is running at a financial loss. And the value of our forests doesn't even translate into the products from logging them. So a majority of native hardwood logs, Brendan and Bob, I know you know this is more for the benefit of everyone watching. Majority of our native hardwood logs are turned into wood chips for export, firewood, fence palings. You know, they're not being turned into thrones or Viking ships or, you know, products befitting of what these are. And this is what swift parrots and koalas are being driven to extinction for. And these are all things that plantations can produce. So that there is very few jobs in native forest logging. It's not profitable. It's been running at a loss, and taxpayers subsidise it. So we sort of begs the question why we're having such a large and contentious debate. And I'll turn to you here, Bob. As taxpayers, we're propping up this native forest logging industry. Yet Australia Institute polling shows that over 70% of Australians want a ban on native forest logging. This includes a majority of voters from both major political parties. Like, why is this so hard? You've been fighting for this for a few years, at least. There's overwhelming public support to end it, and there has been for a long time. Why can't we do it? Why haven't we done it?
Well, it's the corruption of the political system by big money, and that's the logging corporations. They have a big office across from Parliament House in Canberra. The National Forest Industry does. They have a full-time professional lobbyists. In fact, I think it's led up by an ex-Labor member of Parliament at the moment. And they're over there in the Minister's offices and in the Prime Minister's office. And we had the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, giving a speech to the loggers soon after he got in last year, backing their native forest logging, and also, curiously and wrongly, saying that it was a good industry for climate, when in fact it's very destructive, and it's putting all those green. It's a carbon bank that's putting, when it's destroyed, puts all those greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Just yesterday, Prime Minister Albanese was in Hobart, seeing all sorts of people, seriously, and there's big issues, and not least promoting a yes vote for the Voice. But when it came to a small group of people holding an end native forest logging banner, he hurried past, and his mind has ignored them, and the eyes roll. They believe that they're on the side of an industry that counts, but it doesn't. I'm talking about native forest logging here, as you indicated. The vast majority of logging workers and product in Australia is now coming out of plantations. And it's the one thing that's missing here is people taking action. New Zealand, a Labor government coming in there, ended native forest logging 21 years ago. And that's after a huge petition to government and a big action. Now, it's easier in 2023 for Australia to end native forest logging and go to that plantation base than it was for New Zealand back then. But here we are importing plantation products from New Zealand and exporting a majority of what comes out of our native forest to China. And talking about, well, we're actually subsidising a lot of public money that should be going to schools and hospitals and national parks is going into this industry. So it is only hard because those lobbyists representing the 10 or 12% of people who want more native forest logging are outdoing the public clamour for change. And what we're into here is an end game. In Victoria and Western Australia, the Labor governments have decided, and they know that the issue is boiling up, is going to change votes at the next election. So as Ebony said, they're phasing out native forest logging. But in New South Wales and Tasmania, that hasn't happened, even though the Minns Labor government came into New South Wales with everybody presuming that one of the first things they do would be create the Great Koala National Park. Instead of that, the loggers are in that park as we're speaking, cutting down more koala habitat. And that's just the pressure of that industry. It's got Macquarie Street in Sydney, Parliament House, by the throat, and the people are outside the majority, including a huge majority of Labor voters, are not being heard. And it's up to us all to stand up and be heard. As with the Franklin issue way back there 40 years ago, where a Labor government came in and made the change against big vested interests putting pressure on the politicians. So it really depends on how much each of us who love the forest does something to contact our local politicians and say, this has got to stop. And when you're talking to a Labor politician, it's important not to say, well, what do you think about forests? Because they'll all say, oh, we really don't like native forest logging. The question is, will you cross the floor to back the next Teal or Greens motion to end native forest logging? That's what political action requires. And the same with coalition members of Parliament. So the people are on the move. I can feel this rising tide of great activism. I've just done a seminar encouraging young people to get past their depression about what's happening in the world and get active. Don't get depressed, get active. It's on the way. Native forest logging is going to end in Australia. What we've got to do is bring that date forward.
Thank you. I want to come back to that history of Labor and the Franklin, but first I just wanted to touch on something you'd said, about the climate benefit of forests, which seems obvious, and I'm going to ask you this, Brendan. Saving forests is seen as a climate solution, as kind of transactional as that is. There's no doubt that saving our native forests is important for climate and carbon storage, but that's also an incredibly narrow way of viewing them. If we look at it purely from the service that forests provide, they provide more than that. And we know that climate and biodiversity are inextricably linked. So should mitigation well, no, I guess I'll just ask, what are the other benefits of protecting our forests? Mitigation seems like a co-benefit because there are so many other benefits.
Yeah, I don't like the term co-benefit because we're dealing with an ecosystem, right? And the reason why native forests have a mitigation benefit, I'll unpack that a little bit more, is because they're an ecosystem, right? So just let me explain that a bit more. I mean, ecosystems, terrestrial ecosystems, are a core component of the global carbon cycle, right? They play an incredibly important role in geological time, buffering these short-term natural degassing of greenhouse gases from volcanic activity, etc. So the mitigation value of forest ecosystems, or ecosystems generally, but forests are the most biologically productive when it comes to this component. The process of photosynthesis removes carbon from the atmosphere, right? CO2 flows into leaves, dissolves in the leaf. It's the building block for biomass. So a fraction of that carbon is stored in the woody biomass, the trunks and branches and roots of living trees, and a fraction of it is stored in dead woody biomass, and a fraction of that ends up in the soil. It's a dynamic process, but what the mitigation value comes from the long-term accumulated retained stock of carbon in the whole ecosystem, right? That's only there. It's only removed from the atmosphere, converted into these different plant parts, and accumulates in those components of the ecosystem because it's an ecosystem, right? So you actually can't, and the ecosystem is comprised of, and the ecosystem processes are maintained by its biodiversity. So the reason why you have ecosystem carbon is because you have biodiversity. They're not co-benefits of each other. It's just what, if you like, it's what nature does. And if you think about it, ecosystems are the only system we have that removes and accumulates and retains carbon in very large amounts for very long periods of time. There's more carbon stored in the world's ecosystems than there is in the atmosphere at the moment. So when we talk about protecting forests being a climate solution, it's a climate solution because it's a core part of the global carbon cycle we've disrupted. And there's two ways we've disrupted the global carbon cycle: mining fossil fuel, burning that for energy, which puts CO2 into the atmosphere. And if we weren't mining that fossil fuel, it wouldn't be going anywhere. It doesn't naturally degas. The coal and oil and coal and gas wouldn't naturally degas into the atmosphere. We've put it up there. Secondly, as Bob has pointed out, we've completely cleared half of the world's forests, and most of the remaining forests have been industrially logged to some level. And why is that important? Well, because most of the accumulated carbon is in the woody biomass of big old trees, right? That's where most of it is. So a log forest, depending on how heavily you log it, is 30 to 70% plus less accumulated carbon than a log one. And I'll just add to what Bob was saying about the looking at the timber industry. Australia has an incredibly productive and economically valuable timber industry. And as Bob noted, it is plantation based. We currently get 88% of our wood and 88% of our wood from about 1.95 million hectares of plantations. Right? There's actually 132 million hectares of forest in Australia. Right? So we're getting 88% of our wood already from 1.5% of the forest cover, which is plantations. And he's also right about workforce. 83% of the workforce in the forest sector is in manufacturing, right? So the problem we have is actually a lack of capital investment in a kind of a well-planned expansion of the plantation industry to soak up that other 12%. and investment in the new technology for manufactured wood products. Interestingly, when you apply some environmental accounting, I think most of our people watching and listening to us, know about this idea of natural capital accounting, where we can assign an economic value to the benefits society receives from the ecosystem service that come from a native forest. If you stack up all the ecosystem services, the carbon retention, the clean water, unlogged forests produce the cleanest water, right? Think of the economic value of clean water, the ecotourism, think of the costs of trying to, restore threatened species habitat. You add up all those ecosystem service benefits and stack them up, they far, far outweigh the net profit that comes from logging a native forest. So to answer your question, yes, people talk about carbon being a co-benefit of biodiversity protection, but we really need to be. The problem is we have been looking at our native forests like we managing them like it's a car engine and we're a mechanic. Like it's a simple linear deterministic system, and we can extract the unit of whatever out of it. But that's not what we're dealing with. We're dealing with scientifically what we call complex adaptive systems. They're dynamic, they evolve, and the benefits we see in them, they're majestic old growth trees, the forest interior dependent wildlife species and old growth dependent wildlife species, the fresh water they produce, the carbon they produce, they're all the result of it being a complex evolving ecosystem.
Thank you. I was going to ask Bob a question, but following on from that, I need to ask you now off the back of that. There's been the suggestion that a good way to stop native forest logging would be to give the forest industry carbon credits for protecting trees, which they could then sell to polluting industries to offset their emissions. And Ken Henry, the former head of Treasury, acknowledged in a webinar recently about this topic that actually, yes, offsets were a way for fossil fuel companies to keep polluting, but there was a double dividend to be had. I don't actually know what that means, but presumably we can save the forest so fossil fuel companies can keep causing climate change. Is that a good policy solution? Okay.
Before I answer that question, I should say that I'm talking to you from the land of the Yunga Bay language First Nations people from Gold Coast City. I'm at the southern end, and I will be voting yes in the referendum. And I had a very interesting conversation with my taxi driver this morning when I was getting here on the voice, which I'll save for a bit. But to answer your question, so if we go back to my opening response to your first question, the reason why we've got a climate change problem is because we have disrupted the global carbon cycle in two ways. We're continuing to pump fossil fuel CO2 into the atmosphere at it would seem to be increasing rates, and we've dramatically reduced the amount of carbon which is removed from the atmosphere and stored in ecosystems, largely through deforestation and ongoing degradations, including industrial logging, which targets where most of the carbon is stored, which is in the woody biomass of big old trees. So, and that means we're putting more carbon into the atmosphere than what I call the natural sinks take out and remove and store. And there are two natural sinks. One is the oceans, right? CO2 naturally degasses, dissolves into oceans. Some of it gets taken up by the food chain there, and when that organic debris settles to the bottom. The dissolved carbon works its way, a fraction of it each year works its way to the bottom of the ocean. Actually, rain weathers rocks on land, and some of that carbonate gets washed into the oceans as well. So we're putting more carbon into the atmosphere than what can be taken out. by ecosystems and forests. We're making that harder and harder because we keep getting rid of forests, and whenever forests store some carbon, we log them and put the carbon back into the atmosphere. And actually, the oceans is I'll leave for another day. So the only way we're going to solve the problem is if we do two things. We have to stop emissions from both sources, and we have two sources. Currently, about 85 or so percent, maybe 85, 90% of annual greenhouse gas emissions are from fossil fuel, and about 10 to 15% are from deforestation and degradation, right? That percentage has changed over time. If you look at the total accumulated amount, about 1/3 is from deforestation and degradation. That amount has stayed pretty constant about the last 50 years, but the fossil fuel use has increased. Anyway, the only way we can solve the problem and get to net zero emissions globally is by stopping fossil fuel emissions and, as much as we can, preventing further emissions from deforestation and degradation, plus the forest allowing a significant part of the forests that have been degraded to naturally regrow and remove more of their carbon back to their natural carbon carrying capacity. So that's what will solve the problem in terms of greenhouse net zero emissions. Given that, why would you want to have a policy or a mechanism that would neutralise, at best neutralise, the good mitigation work that's done through forest protection and forest regrowth, right, by enabling people to use those removals to offset some amount of fossil fuel emissions, when what we have to do is both, right? We have to do both. We have to stop fossil fuel emissions and increase removals, right? If you may well have not have done the removals if you're going to allow the fossil fuel emissions. I mean, it's not a double dividend. I would call it, there are sins of commission. We all know about sins of commission and omission. That would be a sin of emission. And it's actually worse than that, because as I've been suggesting, forest ecosystems are part of the natural carbon cycle. They provide this incredible buffering capacity, but they are dynamic and they are exchanging CO2 with the atmosphere, and they are obviously vulnerable to land use change and the like. So they are a less I'm trying to think of the right adjective. If you like, they're a less stable stock of carbon, pool of carbon, than the original fossil fuel reserve. Okay, so you've actually, if you do that suggested policy, right, of generating a carbon credit in the forest sector and using that to offset a fossil fuel emission, you haven't really offset it. You've only offset it in some account, right, in some spreadsheet. It's a spreadsheet offset. It's not a scientific offset in terms of the global carbon cycle.
Thank you. That's a brilliant answer. Yeah, I heard the climate's not great at carbon accounting. Well, can't use Excel. I don't. Bob, to that end, WA and Victoria seem to have been able to announce an end to native forest logging without the use of market mechanisms. There's been a transition plan, and yes, we're yet to see the actual end, but there's been an announcement from both those states that they will end native forest logging. This is something states are responsible for, but the federal government also has power, enormous power, to intervene here. I'm really interested to know what the policy mechanisms are that the federal government could be using to protect our native forests and to stop logging, because they do have those powers, don't they?
Just the same as they had the powers after the signing of the World Heritage Convention to save the Franklin River. But what happened during the Howard years is a lot of those powers were given back to the states, because the big mining and logging and other nature exploiters find it much easier to overrun and regulate or get the best out of what they want out of state governments than out of the centralised federal government with so much focus on it. And so it was with forests and the regional forest agreements, the custodianship, which belonged to the federal government, went across to the state governments through those regional forest agreements. And that's been endorsed, that Howard policy has been endorsed by Anthony Albanese, for example, when he spoke to the loggers' dinner in Canberra last year. And it means that the only people who are outside national environmental law in Australia are the loggers. They're exempted. So if you go to log a native forest, which is harbouring a rare and endangered species, you're threatened with jail or big fines. But if a logger does it, that's fine. Now, what the West Australian and Victorian governments have seen is that rising tide of anger, particularly by local people, becoming much more active about their forests. And they've decided it was politically going to be against their interests. It threatened the next elections. And so they've moved on it. I might add that in Western Australia, it's not all done and finished, because part of the deal there was to give big aluminium bauxite miners the up to 9,000 hectares of forest might be scraped from the face of southwest Western Australia in coming years to get at the bauxite underneath. So it's forest loss by another means. But that said, they are responding to political pressure. That's the one thing that, and people becoming active. We saw at the national conference this year of the Labor Party in Brisbane, just in August, that the hundreds of branches of the Labor Party had endorsed a motion from the Labor Environmental Action Network to end native forest logging. And so it was going to pass the conference, but the Albanese team running that conference refused to allow and stop that motion from getting to the floor of conference. Meantime, there were 6,000 people protesting in Brisbane and in cities across Australia, and that's growing rapidly. And what's happened in Western Australia and Victoria, and in Victoria, the Premier there was not known for being an environmentalist. In fact, Daniel Andrews, throughout his whole career, allowed the logging industry to continue. It was only right at the end of that career he moved against it. And so a massive amount of destruction occurred there in that time. What we have to hope is that won't happen with the federal government. The federal government has the powers under Section 51 of the Constitution, and George Williams, the constitutional lawyer, has written about this. It's got power over exports, it's got power over trade, it's got power over taxes, and it's got a power over international conventions on the environment. And it can use any or a mix of those powers to stop environmental destruction, and that includes logging destruction tomorrow. By the way, it's beautifully placed because Labor's got a majority in the lower house, and with the Greens and Teals and Independents in the upper house, to get through legislation to protect Australia's forests tomorrow. It's the federal government's got both the responsibility and the legislative power to do it, and it's got at the moment the numbers to do it. So it's a great opportunity for Anthony Albanese to do that if it wants to right now.
I want to ask you one more question on that, and then we might throw to the audience to ask some questions. But as you suggested, the ALP has got form when it comes to protecting the environment. The Whitlam government blocked oil drilling in the Great Barrier Reef. The Whitlam government ratified the World Heritage Convention, which now enabled Bob Hawke to protect the Franklin River. The Gillard government introduced a carbon price that worked. You've described the other Bob Hawke, as the environmental prime minister, and you've somewhat generously credited him with saving the Franklin, though I think you probably had something to do with it too. You helped other Bob save the Franklin. How can we help the ALP save native forests now? Because it is in their history. it's not, it's kind of on brand.
Yes, and the single thing that's happening here is that the loggers and people who want to mine forests as well, and people who want to destroy them for housing estates and so on, and that becomes very contentious. But koala habitat, they have sway with the Canberra ministry, and we the people have to have greater sway, and we feel locked out from it. Well, we have to get into it. All of us have Labor senators. All of us have close to us Labor members of the lower house, and it's our job to get to them and to go and see them and ask them if they'll come and see the forests, but ask them, will they and are they going to defend the forest whenever the opportunity, or will they move to the forests, as the Teals and Greens have been doing in the Parliament. And it's very, very important for them to go and see the forests. I think, you know, incredibly important to get those MPs to see what local people are seeing in their forests and the wildlife that's there, because to go there is to want to save it. And you know, there's a great fear of going to the forest. In fact, Graham Richardson famously said many years ago, he asked Bob Hawke to go to the forest, and Bob Hawke said, "No, I've seen what happened to you." but there it is. It's just a human reaction, and they respond being lobbied. So that's what's required. That's the missing factor, is this public pressure onto the Labor politicians to get this done at federal level. And indeed, the alternative government for Tasmania would be Labor, and there's a Labor government in New South Wales now which is not acting as was expected. That's where the people come in.
And Polly, do you have a final question for Brendan?
I do, yes. Brendan, I think this is going to be somewhat sobering, so if you could make it as upbeat as possible, that would be great. Maybe do it in song. But what happens if we don't save our native forests? What do we stand to lose?
Well, as Bob had mentioned, we've already lost about half of them in Australia, and much of what's left has been, you know, heavily logged and is in a state of kind of ecological recovery. But despite that, we still have got enormous wealth of habitat for our wildlife species. So we're still, you know, we're still able to save, you know, most of our forest-dependent wildlife species, but the old growth ones, the ones that are, well, if you think about it, 200 years ago, not only did we have twice as much forest cover, but most of it was was older forest, right? Most of it, it was multi-age with a lot of old growth trees. So that, I mean, that's why there's over 400 vertebrate animal species in Australia which depend upon eucalypt tree hollows, right? And we're talking about trees that are 200 years plus. You know, the greater glider in Queensland, which is hollow dependent, it needs trees that are 40 to 50 centimetres in diameter, you know, before it's got tree hollows that it can use. And native forests are logged in Queensland down to 30 centimetres. So with much of the forest that we have left, it's been logged in a way that we've gone from basically having a, if you like, an ocean of old growth with islands of younger growth or scatter of younger trees or multi-age, to the reverse. We've got islands of old growth, you know, in a sea of young regenerating forest. So this means the size of our wildlife species populations have been dramatically reduced. Their ranges have been dramatically contracted. Often they're in not the optimum habitat for them. The most productive forest sites are the ones that tend to be logged. So they're under enormous stress. So they're at risk if we continue. Logging, it's very hard to actually get the way we do greenhouse gas inventory reporting in Australia. it's very hard to actually isolate the how much emissions are from logging. Nationally, it's somewhere between probably 30 to 50 million tonnes of CO2 a year. This is very interesting why you don't see it. It's because we do what's net, it's called net accounting. If you think about it, only about 2% of the managed forest estate is logged in a given year, which is causing all those emissions. The other 98% that's not logged is removing carbon from the atmosphere and going. And those two numbers are added together, they're netted out. So that's why the logging emissions are invisible. We do net accounting. In fact, the removals from the forest that's not being logged in a given year, because they're annual reports, not only does it net out in the accounts, it's netted out in the accounts, not in the atmosphere, if you like, in the accounts, the logging emissions, it also nets out most of the agricultural emissions and 14% of the fossil fuel emissions, right? There was a nice paper we did looking at the kind of 10 years of greenhouse gas inventory that was reported for Tasmania. And the year around 2015, there was a big drop in wood chip production, a huge drop in the area of native forest that was logged. Others can tell you the reasons for that. It's something to do with the wood chip mill ceasing to operate, and also a drop in international demand for native forest wood chips. But that revealed the emissions from logging. It was in Tasmania, there was on an annual basis, there was about 10 million tonnes of CO2 emitted from logging. And each year there was about 10 million tonnes of removals from natural forest growth. And on an annual basis, they were netted out, and you didn't see anything. Or you saw a little positive because there was more removed than emitted, and people would say, well, logging's good for forests. When you had that sudden drop in native forest logging, those numbers, the gross numbers were revealed, and you could see the actual emissions from logging and the power of native forest growth. So if we continue not to protect all our native forests, our old growth dependent wildlife are definitely at great risk, and we've done ourselves and future generations a great disservice by not, making use of and optimizing, what has to be part of a comprehensive approach to net zero emissions in Australia.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Polly, for that incredible conversation. I do have a lot of questions from the audience. We've got 1,000 people registered for today's webinar and several hundred of you on the line with us live right now. The first question that I've got is, why is that right down the bottom all of a sudden, is from Alan Evans. And Bob, I'm going to put this one to you. It's about what can we do about the draconian laws being introduced targeted to discourage protest, and in particular environmental and climate activists. I know that's something that you work on and have been subject to yourself quite a lot.
Well, firstly, back those people who are going to reverse those laws if they get into office. That does include the Greens and a swathe of independents. But in nearly all cases, Labor and Liberal got together with the National Party to put through that legislation, and some right-wing independents. But more importantly, don't be deterred by it. It's very important that we are not put off by the threat. I'm personally with two women who stood in front of up in some swift parrot logging country. While the swift parrots were nesting in the forests, they were logging them last November. And for our troubles, we faced the Magistrates Court in early December, 3rd or 4th of December, and potentially up to 3 years in jail if they invoke these new laws. But it's not a deterrent as far as I'm concerned. I can joke about it. I've got a book to write, and what a wonderful circumstance to find myself in to write a book, because I'm too distracted by environmental activism. But for many people, jail is a very daunting threat. And my friend, veterinarian Collier Harmson, is in Mary Hutchinson Women's Prison here in Hobart at the moment for 3 months for simply peacefully getting in the way of forest destruction and wildlife loss. But we have this opportunity, and we have to get out of our comfort zone. And we have to say, well, that's not going to stop us. And we have to do this for our children and our children's children and for our fellow creatures on this planet. And as I said at the start of this webinar, we're not threatened in the way that people elsewhere in much more dire circumstances are. So we really just have to stop thinking about being comfortable all the time and move sometimes into an area of discomfort. And that's why I'm so proud to be with the younger and older people who are standing for the forests in New South Wales and in Tasmania and against fossil fuel exports as well, for the reasons that Brendan so cogently put forward. We have to get out of our comfort zones if we're going to end this. And the sooner we do, the sooner it will finish. Violence has no place in this. Peaceful action is what we're about. But we cannot have our right to peaceful action taken away from us by legislative moves, by the big corporations on weak-spine politicians. So, but you know, many people can't do that. Well, fund the activist organisations, donate to them that are doing that, and encourage those people who are doing that, and write to the newspapers. That's what the politicians read, those letter columns, and get online and contact your politicians. We've all got a role to play here. We've all got something we can do. And at the end of this is the saving of those native forests. And in the process, preventing that carbon going to the atmosphere, which is such a prodigious and nasty threat to everybody's future and to the future of nature on this planet. We are in an existential crisis, but most of us are acting as if it's just everything's okay. Well, it's not, and we have to move a little bit more into taking action or supporting those who are taking action. And the sooner we do that, the sooner our forests will be saved.
Thanks, Bob. I've got a follow-up question for Brendan from Jock Churchman, who asked a little bit more about your opinion of carbon offsets going into forestry, and wanted to know, can they also be seen as a way of working towards the preservation of native forests? So I just wonder if you could summarise again for us those concerns that you had about carbon offsets for Jock. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's important to be clear about how we're using the term offset and carbon offset, because a lot of uses of the word offset is really not in the sense I'm using it, which is a very scientific one, i.e. it is in the context of how we restabilise the global carbon cycle, right? A lot of offsets are actually used in the context of what we call payment for ecosystem service schemes, right? Where you're trying to provide incentives, financial incentives for landowners or managers or custodians to change the way they manage all or part of their land in order to give some conservation outcome. And I think there are many contexts in Australia where that's important to do. I know the work we've done. We've just finished doing a very detailed study of all the remaining old growth forest habitat for greater gliders in Queensland, and also examining that by tenure. Interestingly, in the southern half of the state, about half is on protected areas and half is in state forests scheduled to be logged. In the northern half of the forest of the state, though, most of it's on private and leasehold land. Okay, so it's one thing, governments can clearly take very direct action about forest that's on public land and state forest. What kind of mechanisms can we use on private and leasehold land? And so payment for ecosystem service schemes is something which I think can be really useful here. Queensland has one called there's a land carbon fund, where the carbon is seen as part of a mix of environmental benefits that definitely include biodiversity. So I think there's ways of setting up payment for ecosystem services schemes. We can talk about how they can be funded. They can be done through levies or taxes or industry levies or whatever, that can provide financial incentives to private and leasehold landowners and managers to help protect nature. On top of the legal requirements regarding threatened species and threatened ecosystems and the like. I mean, this is above all of that. But, you know, when what I think people here are talking about is where we either change land use or land management to avoid an emission from clearing or logging of forest, or we undertake some kind of revegetation to start to grow a forest and remove carbon over time as that forest grows. And so the idea is by avoiding a specific, you know, if we say we were going to clear or log this area of forest and we're not going to do it now, and this is how much carbon we've avoided losing, or here's a cleared area, we're going to replant it and it will grow that much carbon. People argue that should be sold to offset an equivalent amount of fossil fuel emissions. Again, the logic of it just escapes me. The economics of it escapes me. We should be rewarding people for, I agree, let's reward people for, if it's on private and leasehold land, for avoiding deforestation, degradation, and let's reward them for ecological restoration, both of which will help restore the global carbon cycle. But I don't see the logic of, you know, if you do that and sell that as a credit, that just puts more fossil fuel up into the atmosphere, right? In fact, an avoidance emission by definition can't in any shape, sense or meaning of the term offset a fossil fuel emission. I mean, avoiding something that, you know, that hasn't happened how can that offset an emission? I mean, it doesn't offset an emission, right? So I really struggle with the logic of it. And maybe 50 years ago, there was an argument that let's just get some action happening and getting people used to thinking about carbon and, you know, let's just get a carbon economy going. But, you know, we're past that. As Bob said, we are literally, I mean, I cannot stress more the extent to which we are in a global climate crisis. We have another 0.4 degrees of warming locked in, which we will hit around 2030, right? And every increment above that brings the risks of more catastrophic and irreversible climate impacts and consequences. I mean, it's got to be all hands on deck, and we have to be looking at how we can avoid emissions in all sectors. And the only place we can increase removals is in the land sector through restoration. Let's not throw away that good mitigation work in the land sector by subsidising further fossil fuel emissions.
Polly, do you have anything that you want to add to that?
No, I was just going to add, it's a really good point where in terms of subsidising, I know you didn't mean it in the actual financial sense, Brendan, but we...
Oh, I did, actually. I meant it.
Okay. Oh, I just thought it was really nice subsidising their social licence. Okay, yeah, but we do. We subsidise the fossil fuel industry and we subsidise native forest logging. Governments are actively subsidising climate change, really. And if you want to talk about funding, you know, providing direct incentives to landholders or industry, you don't even have to look for extra money elsewhere. Just stop subsidising the bad stuff. Stop doing harm first and foremost.
And as we said earlier, you know, we don't need to log our native forest to supply wood and pulp and source material for manufactured wood products, right? We don't need to. We've got a very you know, a lot of money has been invested in our plantation sector. It's very efficient. It's very effective. It's actually profitable, and we just need to be focused on that. You know, I'm very supportive of the plantation forestry sector. It's where the jobs are. It's where the value adding is.
Thank you. I think we've got time just very quickly for one more question. I'm going to put it to both of you, Bob and Brendan. Basically, Australia is looking at another El Nino summer of extreme temperatures, and there's a lot of concern in the questions and in the chat around bushfires and the impact on forests that have either been logged or that currently exist. Brendan, I wonder if I can come to you first on the impact of more extreme temperatures and the role that forests play, I guess, when it comes to bushfire season and what we know about that heading into this summer.
So there's both a climate component, climate change component here, and also a land use component. So again, the climate fact of the matter is that climate change has brought about a massive increase in dangerous fire weather conditions in Australia, particularly since the 1970s. This is completely established now. And fire weather is what drives dangerous bushfire conditions, okay? And that is dryness. Actually, it's the pre-fire season dryness. In southern Australia, how dry our winter is, or our autumn is. And on the day, the temperature and then the wind. The wind's actually the most important factor by about four. What climate change is doing is dramatically increasing two of those triggers, if you like. One is we're getting a significant and ongoing decrease in winter rainfall in southern and eastern Australia. In Perth, it's about 20%. Elsewhere, it's about 17%, and that trend is going to continue. And then secondly, as we're all experiencing, we're getting what used to be January or February heat waves in September, right? So now we're seeing, as we did, and then when we get an El Nino period starting, as we did in 2019, you have a dry winter, a dry spring, a super heat wave, then you just need a big wind, and bang, you've got catastrophic fire weather conditions. Under extreme, you might have noticed our new fire weather warnings. Extreme now starts in the middle, right? Extreme used to be over there, and then they added catastrophic. Now they've brought catastrophic up and they've brought extreme up. As soon as you hit extreme, it's the flammability of the bush which is important, right? It's how dry the vegetation is, which is what drives what we call the burn severity of the bushfire. It's not how much vegetation there is. So this is the big science-based story that hasn't really hit yet, is that you can do all the fuel reduction burning you like over as many thousands of hectares if you like. It won't affect it. It won't reduce the flammability, because that's a function of the moisture content of the vegetation, which is really driven largely by these climatic factors. But that effect is amplified, that flammability is amplified by land use and in particular logging. It's now been very well established that when you commercially log a forest, you open up the canopy, you increase incoming sunlight, evaporation, you basically have a drier forest, and as I said, a drier forest is more flammable. It's also been established that old growth forest is wetter and cooler. It can still burn, but it burns at a much lower burn severity. And it also, as does rainforest, because it's wetter and cooler, retards the forest. Rainforest does it most, tall, wet, old growth forest does it second best, etc. So, we really need to be taking what the science is telling us about climate change seriously, and about the impact of land use on both of those interacting are increasing the flammability and fire risk in our native forests.
And Bob, I'll just come to you quickly to wrap us up. Your response to that question around, obviously people are very anxious coming into summer about the bushfire risk. Anything that you want to add to what Brendan has said there about the role that forests play?
Very simply, logging of native forest makes the hazard of bushfires worse. It endangers us all from bushfires. It's almost counterintuitive, but that's what happens. And, we should put an end to it. It's just one of those factors that's going to help make us safer in the future, both by keeping the temperature down and by making the bushfires, as Brendan's just so beautifully explained, less potent, less destructive, less damaging to us all. We're in a period of crisis and we need to take unusual action. And, come on, Albo. That's a swift parrot. They're going to be down to 70, scientists tell us, by the end of this decade if you keep logging native forest. Let's put an end to it, Albo.
Great spot to end our webinar. Thank you so much to our special guests today, Professor Brendan Mackey and Bob Brown, former leader of the Australian Greens and head of the Bob Brown Foundation, and my colleague Polly Hemming. Thank you so much for joining us today, everyone. We really appreciate you coming along. And don't forget to check out our other webinars coming up. You can find all those details and sign up to our mailing list at australiainstitute.org.au. Don't forget to sign our ending native forest logging petition. You can also find that on our website. And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast, Follow the Money. You can find that on iTunes or wherever you normally listen to podcasts. Thank you so much for coming along today. Thank you, Bob and Brendan, for your words of wisdom and action for everyone who's tuned in today. And thank you everyone at home for tuning in to hear about this important issue and this real opportunity that we have, a renewed opportunity that doesn't come along very often, with 2 states moving ahead to ending native forest logging. It's a huge opportunity for Australia to end native forest logging right across the country once and for all, and all the amazing biodiversity and other climate impacts and things and benefits that will come from that. Thanks so much for joining us today. We'll see you next time. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to keep up to date with all our latest research and work, sign up to our newsletter. Delivered every fortnight, it includes behind-the-scenes updates from Richard Dennis, an exclusive cartoon from Judy Horacek, details for our upcoming events and webinars, as well as explainers, graphs, and not to mention the latest cutting-edge research and analysis from the team here on the key issues that are facing Australia. Click the button on your screen to check it out.